Hello, and welcome to Data Unchained, a podcast about making data a global resource. I'm Molly Presley. I'm the host of Data Unchained. Today, I'm really pleased to get to welcome Roxane Googin. She is a woman of many talents and has had a great experience in the investment community as chief futurist of Group 11. She is an investor and was also the longtime thought leader and 20-year producer of the High Tech Observer, a guidance newsletter on high-tech stocks. Roxane, you have an amazing track record of predicting global trends on the economy, on technology. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, glad to be here.
So can you tell me a little bit about your background?
It's pretty varied. I got a BSEE back in 1980, which was the worst year you could possibly graduate from college until 2008. And I had a lot of experience doing different things. I was a co-op. I put myself through college working at IBM. So I worked in manufacturing. I worked in hardware development. I worked in software development, ranging from assembly language programming, 8-bit controllers all the way through mainframes. And unusual for people in this day and age, I worked 1.5 years in manufacturing, which was a fabulous experience. And I think something that's going to become much more relevant as we discuss going forward. After my MBA, I worked in venture capital, equities, and debt. So when I walk into a situation, I have a lot more experience than other people in the room because I've done it myself. And that gives me a broader view of the trends that are changing our lives in a macro way that tend to be missed by people with narrower viewpoints.
That's a fair point. And I think as we prepare the audience for this conversation and the background, one of the things I think that's really unique about you is often you say the unsaid. Sometimes the messages you bring aren't the rosy side of what's going on in the world, but also looking at some of the more difficult challenges we're facing. And I think that's really valuable to be able to look at both sides of the coin, figure out, how might this affect future of both for humans as well as for our technology. And it was something I'm really excited to dig deeper into with you.
Great.
So where does your experience, you really dug into a lot with the technology side. I know that you were working with data way back, even with Larry Ellison and with Oracle. Can you tell us a little bit more of your experience even back on the data side as well?
Oh, I made my bones on Wall Street originally doing two things, both of which were fascinating. One was following the disk drive business. The disk drive business was the industry that Clayton Christensen followed in writing Innovator's Dilemma because it changed so fast. And it had to keep up. It's a relentless business. So it was fascinating to watch them survive and not survive. And then the other thing that I did was, because again, I worked in software, I was able to understand very quickly the power of not only the ability of semiconductors to grow in power, that seems to be lost on people even back when Moore's Law was still alive, but the power of new abstraction layers. So Ted Codd developed the relational database at IBM in the 70s. And because network-based databases at IBM performed faster and had a big revenue stream, IBM just sat on it. But Larry Ellison didn't. So he got hold of the software, I think it was an ANSI standard, and back-ported it to every single Linux system. And everyone said, oh, that'll never work. It's too slow. What are you doing? And I'm like, this is going to take over the world. Okay, this is 1987, just to give you an idea of, what it was running on, the limited power. And Larry wasn't popular. I'll say that on. And I mean, just as an aside, his first analyst meetings, I filled half the chairs. There were 2 rows. Okay. It was at the Marriott at the San Francisco airport. And I was just relentless. He was just relentless. No one else. Again, it was so big, they couldn't see it. And it was just immediately obvious how transformative this was. And who would have guessed how big it got? Which, again, is kind of a message that I'll repeat is happening again. And we can go on about that. So that was really, I don't know how much more you had to do in that day and age. And again, later on, after the dot-com bust, and we can talk about that, in 2002, it became obvious to me that the architecture that would replace single system image servers that were proprietary, which is, again, what the world ran on back in 2002, was going to give way to these, I called them gangs of commodity servers, and that you had to spread the data across them. And this was before the term cloud computing existed, before the term data lake existed. But it was obvious where the architecture had to go, if you just, again, took everything into account. So until that time, so that was, and even to now, relational databases are useful. I think they're coming to the end of their useful life because I think, and we'll talk about this later, I guess, because the environment that we're in is getting too chaotic to support such backward-looking and rigid architectures.
I think there's a couple other trends before we kind of start talking about the future a bit more. You've bumped into David Flynn and his companies a few times. You talked a bit about the evolution of hard disk drives, but what got you excited about Fusion IO and the work they were doing with SSDs related to these architectures?
Well, again, it took me about 1 second. Because I understand disk drives, I understand storage, I understand latency. And they're so slow, and they're awful. So
it's one of those obvious moments of a new technology comes out, and everyone is used to something else. But once you look at the merits of the new technology, it became obvious.
It was literally in 1 sentence. It was, well, duh. Like, of course you would do this if you could. And then the challenge there again, and people couldn't see it again, was it was very expensive back then. I mean, the chips were, the NAND was, it wasn't very reliable. You had a lot of bad gates in there, and it was per bit, it was so much more expensive than any alternative that you could possibly have. And so you had to look a few years into the future and say, well, Moore's Law's still alive. We're still shrinking. This will be taken care of. And with a lot of software, which they just didn't even know half of what Dave was doing. That's the crazy part. What he did was so amazing. But, he went over all the problems and exactly how to solve them. And just to give you an idea of how far ahead of his time he was, Intel came out with this NVMe alternative. I hate to say this, Micron, who kind of adopted it, is still ramping it.
That's right.
So this is 2004 compared to 2022. That's how far ahead.
Tech, that's an enormous amount of time.
It's ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah. So that's how far ahead of the curve Dave, continues to be. So it was just obvious. Again, things are just obvious to me. And that was just very obvious that it would work and that the world really could use that. Because access to data is so critical. It's your competitive advantage.
And that's a piece I'd love to talk a little bit more about. I know that you were very involved early on also with the idea of AI processing with GPUs. And that's an area where data becomes so important. If GPUs are interesting, they're very fast, they do things efficiently. Artificial intelligence is a fantastic idea, but if you can't get data to it, it's much less valuable. But I think just talking a little bit about how did you come across the concept of AI and the value that GPUs would add? And as you think about the next things that are going to happen with the value of data? How do you pull those all together in your mind?
The AI thing, I didn't introduce it to the world at all, but I sure introduced it to Wall Street. And I remember putting out a bunch of pieces. It was 2016, explaining everything. Again, it was just obvious. And I forget where, I read a lot. I don't know. I picked it up. I'm sitting here in Park City. Like, no one came over and told me about it. And it was just obvious, again, the power of it. And I remember writing this thing. I had a business partner who would sell, he was my sales agent. And he's like, no one's heard of this. You could have bought NVIDIA all day at $33, okay, which is what I was doing. Because, they're like, well, it's like this so game vendor. Like, what are you even talking about? I'm like, this is the next world. Like, like, this is so powerful. You have no idea, and anyway, and, how can I say it? And it was clear, just like you said, you couldn't do this on. Okay, I am not an Intel fan. Never have been. Like, I knew Intel was toast, again, by about 2015. And it was just obvious they couldn't get off their old architecture. They were stuck on 14 nanometers. They lost the smartphone business, so they didn't have the volumes. It was pretty obvious they were toast and they were mismanaged. So you couldn't use a CPU, and it was just a new form. Everything was coming together. The software needed the parallelism, just like you said, and the low cost, and there was NVIDIA, and they were just starting to use it. And like I said, my partner was like, "No one's heard of this," and I said, "That's not my fault. Like, they're hearing it." And again, this was my reputation, because I would come up with things from outer space, and they just couldn't even believe it. And then it would happen.
I think one of the things that I admire about what you do, you understand the technology well enough to be able to identify the value of the technology, not necessarily the brand. And as we kind of talk about what's going on in the world today, I know that you're starting to think a lot about that the big brands maybe are going to start to lose a foothold with all these new technologies come out. Kind of what's your current expectation on where we are today?
Well, really, my expectation on where we are today isn't even about technology as much anymore. I used the first MRP systems like back in the 80s. Like, I saw with my own eyes what intelligence would do to revolutionize productivity. And back in the 90s, I'll just, this is dating myself, but it tells you the magnitude of what's happening. So I lived through the 70s. Not a lot of fun, lived through the 80s. And every time you turned around, there was inflation. Like, you were just so stuck, and it was debilitating. And so when the 90s came, I was on Wall Street again by that time. And I could see the inventory turn, because we used to worry about things like inventory turns. Like, that's how you measured a stock, believe it or not, back then.
Yeah, and I remember that.
Okay. And Western Digital particularly went from 4 turns a quarter to 100. Like, it was stunning. And everyone's in the early 90s. They're like, well, we can't, the economy's growing. We're going to get inflation again. Everyone had PTSD, right? And I said, we're going to grow without inflation, because people are buying these computers and they're actually getting more output from a given input, and you can grow without inflation for that reason. And that's exactly what happened. That is the force that gave us the fantastic 1990s stock market, because no one thought that could happen. And so now you're running into, I used to call it the techonomy. And I'm not the only one that used that, but I might have been the first. And it's, you can no longer separate technology from socioeconomic. Mm-hmm. So now I'm going to talk about, your answer about brands. So as technology got more and more powerful, and everyone had the cell phone deeper into our lives, way into our heads, the merger between technology and socioeconomics is like pretty thorough. By this point, it's, humans use tools, and fire was a big one. I would say, digital technology is kind of up there at that level. So what happened in the 2000s, which was interesting, you had the blow up, and we can talk about why that was obvious later if you want. And then it was a disaster. It was like you had to be there. It was so awful. And that is exactly what allowed the cloud to exist. You had to go through that difficulty to get everybody through all the hard work of all the progress to make the cloud actually cost effective. It was not easy to do. And everyone had to do it, and they only did it because life was hard. And so then we got to this point, and through this century so far, when you were looking at the progress of technology, it was in a vacuum. Our society was stable, right? The economy, we had 2008, that was a bit of a problem. But generally, we knew what the government was going to be. Our houses weren't burning down. I mean, things were a lot more predictable than they are now. And so what you saw, you could say, well, Facebook is going to grow with this smooth curve, because this is how fast things grow. And you assumed that the world around them was static and predictable,
right.
Okay, to a point. And that's an assumption. That's not a given. We were lucky. So we had that. And in that time, the driving force was the technology. And so you would associate with the brand name.
And then as you think about also some of the other destabilizing factors they're front of mind, I think, for all of us right now: political challenges, war, what's going to happen with oil, where will it come from? Do you feel like this all ties together into the concept of those who will flourish will be able to handle this instability? Kind of how do you see what's going on in Ukraine affecting all of this?
I'll go back to what's going on even on a broader scale. I think Ukraine is a symptom, not a cause. So the cause, and I'm going to borrow heavily from people who thought about this, okay? So there's Ray Dalio, The Changing World Order, and then there's William Strauss and Neil Howe, and they did The Fourth Turning. And all of these guys are predicting a repeat of the 1930s in the 2020s, and that is not a compliment. So the Fourth Turning guys, William Strauss and Neil Howe. And Neil Howe is pretty active on YouTube. You can see him talk. William's kind of low key. Is about every fourth generation, you just get this repeat of all the mistakes that have been made through the millennia. It's like people don't learn a thing, and at first they all get along, and increasingly each generation, as it doesn't see the hardships of the first generation, they get kind of more spoiled and lazy, and then just everything ends up in fighting. And so that's their observation. Now, doing the same historical viewpoint, Ray Dalio, who's incredible, I just can't say enough about him. He has spent hundreds of millions of dollars not only going through each era of history, but from a financial standpoint, he has done things like measured GDP per capita for the last 500 years. And these are hard numbers. and then he is so out there. He has these mental models of what's going to happen. Then he applies numbers to them with historical data. Then he runs the model to see if it works compared to what recent history was. And then he runs it forward. So his data are second to none. And we are currently in what he would describe as the end of a large debt cycle, which means our government has issued too much fiat currency for its ability to pay, and for, importantly, the ability of the system to produce goods and services. And when that happens, you start to get inflation, which is what we're seeing. And inflation isn't really prices going up. it's the dollar going down. People kind of get it upside down. Like your house did not go up in value. It's the same house, but the dollar sure did. And when you combine that with wide income divides in a country, and then what follows from them, does this sound familiar, is wide political divides in a country, and people aren't working together, and then you add an economic downturn, you can get violence. And this is the history of the world. Like, it happens again. It's like we learn nothing. Our tools are better, but emotionally, we're apes in the savannah. We just learn nothing at all. And so we have a lot of symptoms of, and it's like we really, maybe it won't be so, you don't know if it's going to be exactly like the 1930s, but it's going to be disruptive. You're going to have, and I think one of the main things to be aware of, and this goes back to technology, is, post World War II, America, ran the show, right? And, as I always say, well, the failure rate of world leaders is 100%. Otherwise we wouldn't be the world leader and be so young, right? Someone else would have hung on somehow, but no one ever has. And so, just pay attention there. And I'll borrow again from Ray Dalio, but he's not the only one. So underneath all this change is just evolution. Like, change just never stops. And after the war, the world wars, everything settles down. Someone gets to be in charge because they beat everybody else. They set up these systems that are supposed to last forever, that benefit them and that organize productivity and, political activity, right? So the World Bank, banking in general, large corporations, that all came with political stability and the rise of IT. It's interesting how companies grew in size directly as a function of how big their computers could be, right? You didn't get a global corporation until you got the cloud. First it was mainframes and, and everyone was kind of small. And then as they got bigger and bigger, anyway, you see the point.
Well, I think that even countries were measured on their compute power. Which company has the biggest supercomputer, the most compute power? Like, there is a race even to that, to your point.
There is, and it matters. It doesn't determine, it matters. Those are
right.
So
and sometimes it's a perception, if nothing else.
It's like necessary, but not sufficient, I would say. But, so going back to this whole techonomic thing, the forces that are in place, and this goes back to your question about brand names, actually, is, you had Oracle, you have, stuck data structures, you have these big corporations, all of which are blowing up. I mean, look at Boeing, look at GE, look at IBM. They're all just, time has changed. And these quote unquote permanent companies are blowing up one after another as the world under them changes. In a fourth turning or in a big debt restructuring cycle, both of which the guys with numbers think that we're in, like we are in this now. It's creative destruction. It's painful. There's a lot of losses, but as the world changes, you need to change the structures that run it, or else there's no progress. That doesn't happen.
Who is your model for a next-gen success story? Who do you look at that you think is the model of what will succeed coming through this?
I'm going to now change channels to Nassim Taleb and Antifragile. So he has thought quite a bit about long-tail probabilities and who lives in times of low visibility and chaos. And they tend to be agile and they tend to be small. But the one company that does come to mind and the one entrepreneur that does come to mind is Tesla. And he thrives. I mean, even this past quarter, you can just see it in the numbers. All these, GM, Ford, they can't get parts. They have just boatloads of cars sitting there because they're rigid production systems can't deal with the shutdowns in China that just keep changing. And this is not going to end. Again, we're never going to get rid of COVID. And we're going to get, I think, more and more of these things, particularly in the animal kingdom, as our environment degrades. You're seeing the H1B1 bird flu. They're killing millions of chickens. There's the swine flu. So, we're always going to be being kind of upended by these things. I think that's the new normal. But right now in China, it's COVID, and the old car companies they can't deal. And again, on the Tesla call, people were asking, "How did you get the parts?" And Elon, I guess he was pumping up the stock so he could get it high enough to get the loan to buy Twitter. But anyway, and he said, we hustled. It was that simple. And having been in manufacturing, again, I remember when FedEx went to 50 pounds, we had a party, because our lines were always shut because there was something that wasn't there. So I know what that feels like, to have to hustle through things. And, it's chaos. You just have to hustle through. So I would definitely say Tesla is the prototypical, because I'm going to go a little further at the moment, and then we can get back, and again, Hammerspace fits right in the middle of all this. I'll go back to, again, just looking at stocks. You have 30% declines in Netflix and Meta. And I do think that as we deglobalize, which is, again, part of this fourth turning business, it's the, for the last 20 years, what mattered was effectively eyeballs and selling Chinese stuff to American teenagers, and like supremely unproductive thing. But, and I think that the end of those stocks is the end of an era. Like, they're not coming back. And I do believe that manufacturing is going to come back to America, and that will end up being very good. And again, the people that are there first are going to be the next cloud computing vendors. They're going to do very well, but it won't be easy. And you can't wait. Like, you can't wait for someone else to be first. You have to just believe this or not and just dive in.
So you're talking a lot about, the types of companies that are going to rise above in this fourth era, so to speak. What do you think the outlook is for financial markets short term, kind of the near term outlook?
Well, it depends on the bond markets. And again, not many equity people understand this. So like, everyone who understands bond is looking at that 30-year yield at the moment, and it's, it could be breaking the 40-year downtrend, right? That was predicated in part on global supply chains, and it's not clear what's going to happen. We have deflationary pressures that are very strong. We have kind of transient-ish inflationary supply pressures, and then we have too many dollars sloshing around. Okay, so those are the key factors. And if the Fed, if we fail to sell our bonds, okay, that's typically how currencies die, okay, because there is too much debt out there and no one wants to admit it. And so we're kind of skating on thin ice. And then the question is, when does the con job end? When do people lose faith in that dollar? That's why the Fed has to get the dollar back down again fast. One of the things that Yuval Harari, he says a lot of smart things. And one of the things that he really focuses on is what's unique about humans versus any other animal. And it's that we believe, we can share a belief. And that belief is so strong, we'll die for it. So religion has been, no other animal does that. Like, we are definitely unique there. And the belief that dominates the world right now, it's just so bizarre, is the dollar. That's replaced religion as the common belief system. when ISIS, they're like, kill America. And, we're not perfect, let me tell you. I can see why people are mad at us. They want to kill America. You know what they fought over? Dollars. Who got the most dollars? It is like Putin. Like, he's trying to upset Western society, but he likes those dollars a lot. And so it's...
but you can't buy your oil with them.
Yeah, it's so you can see we're losing our dominance in currencies. People are forming blocks, right? And so what happens, and we cannot afford a failed bond option. Like, that would just start undermining this deep-seated belief that people have. And right now, and I'm changing channels. I'll go back to Ray Dalio, is, you can degrade your global currency, but it really doesn't go away historically until there's a replacement. And then, and I don't think it's the renminbi at all. I don't think China is nearly as strong as people think. They're not without anything, but they're not like Russia. But I don't think, no one trusts them. It's just not, it's going to happen. And oddly, the fact that our culture just dominates the world, it just makes it more natural that they would use dollars too. And they'll put up with a lot of grief in order to do it because it kind of works. What happens to the market, to answer your question, is a function of what happens to that dollar. And we are in a dicey situation right now because we're ending a 40-year down cycle in bonds, and it's not clear where that goes. If interest rates go up, in other words, people start selling the bonds, then our government is so obviously bankrupt. It's already bankrupt, but then it's like really obviously bankrupt because the interest payments will be like bigger than our defense budget in about 5 minutes. And we obviously can't support that. So they are, the biggest buyer of our bonds is our treasury. That's why they have 9 trillion of them sitting there. So if that blows up, then you get the 80% decline in stocks. That, has happened before. Things like that could happen.
History repeats itself, right?
History just does. And what happens is the people die. So then your grandparents are dead, and then your great-parents, and then everyone forgets everything, and then they do it again. It's like Groundhog Day. So anyway, I'm kind of thinking that that's not going to happen. But again, I'll go back to Nassim Taleb. He's like, live to fight another day. Like, first rule, don't die. And so, you want that bomb shelter, base load of investment. And then you want, it's almost like a barbell. And then you want the most change-oriented things. The stuff in the middle is what gets obliterated. And so everyone worries, the stock market was up and down this much today. And it's like, half those companies won't even be there because life will be too tough. Life will tear them apart.
I could talk to you for hours about this. It's such a fascinating, I can't tell you the number of questions I want to ask, but for the sake of the time for this episode, and as we kind of tie things up, we're in a period of chaos, entering a period of chaos. Where, do you see hope at the end of the road? Kind of what do you see over the next few years at this next era? Where do you see things going?
Well, again, it's like you have to eat your vegetables. Again, 2002 looked pretty bleak. Again, been there, done that. Like the 80s looked pretty bleak. And so this will look bleak because that is what's necessary to get people off their duff, to do the necessary changes, because, I kind of look at like the world we live in like a lava flow. Like evolution is always happening. We think the ground is stable. It's not. It just changes at a rate that we're not conscious of. And so all the buildings on it are like slowly falling apart, because that's just, you can't stop it. Buddha figured that out 2,500 years ago, and like it hasn't changed. And so we have to change, and we put in these structures that make us feel good. They're all temporary. Like they have to be. And so that's just the way it is. And so they're going to fall apart. I was just Herb Stein, who like, and I don't know, in the 80s, wrote this down. If something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And, we're at one of those moments where we're just, it's the come to Jesus, you got to change. And it's promising because you're getting off the old shackles. Like, what if we still ran on Sun Microsystem servers? What if we still ran on mainframes? That wouldn't be okay. And so you have no choice but to go with it. It's good in the end, but it's not easy. And, the tough get going and you're just clear-eyed about it. Right? I mean, and if you're the first, I mean, the companies that are the biggest now lived through the dot-com bust. Like they were starting then. Does that make sense? And now they're huge. Google, I don't know. I know CRM was 1999. I think Google was 1998. And they went public in 2004, when there was a lot of dust still in the air. It was not an easy time.
Kind of thinking back, most of this podcast really doesn't focus on the company I work for, David's company, Hammerspace. But I have to ask, what's exciting to you about this idea of global data, making data not locked inside of Sun Microsystems boxes and not being stuck in where right next to the mainframe that created it? You just think about data being a global resource. How does that help?
Well, it's like having a nervous system versus not having a nervous system. I broke my back. Like I can't communicate with my legs anymore. It doesn't work very well. And as again, look at Tesla, look at GM. GM lives on these real stable, gigantic, hyper efficiency is going to go away. There will be some cost increases here because agility will take its place. And the person that, that the company that doesn't have immediate access to all the data all the time, the stuff that they didn't even think they wanted is in the wheelchair. And then the other guys are going to run past them. It's a chaotic time. So I think this is like oxygen.
It creates this vision, as you were talking about, a lot of lessons learned we lose as older people pass away. It's also with data. There's a lot of data out there nobody even knows they have. And don't lose the things we learned. Don't lose the data we created, and then make it available to the folks who need it.
Yeah, there was a great quote on CNBC from a CEO of a software company. And he says, the problem with data is it's not available at the time of decision. And you're always like, I know I had that somewhere. And then you spend all this time looking for it because it's locked away somewhere. And you shouldn't have to know that. It should be, it should be the perfect Google search,
Right. Have it at the point of decision so You can be agile and you can get through these rocky times. Hey, Roxane, is there anything else you'd like to add as we close up?
Hang in there. It's exciting. Like, don't be afraid of change. You have no choice.
Yeah. Embrace the change.
Yeah. And be the first.
To read more about Roxane, there's a couple of articles that I've enjoyed reading. She's published a lot over the years, but recently there's an article called Managing in an Era of Chaos and another called The End is Near. If you want to read more about Roxane, those are great resources. And Roxane, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Data Unchained, powered by Hammerspace. To learn more, visit hammerspace.com. If you have a guest you would like to hear on the show, email me at molly@hammerspace.com.